Thank you, Eric, and good evening. Good evening to everyone. I want to begin by thanking Tom Farr and his colleagues, not only for their exemplary work in promoting and defending religious freedom, but for honoring Archbishop Charles Chaput, a great defender of religious freedom for all and the model of a Catholic bishop in the 21st century. It's nice to hear a few words from Rick Warren. The last time I had a conversation with Rick was about 3 or 4 years ago, totally unexpected. I was sitting at home of a late Sunday afternoon watching a football game, as I recall, and the phone rang, and it was, I picked it up, and he said, "Hi, George, it's Rick Warren." I said, "Oh, hey, Rick, what's up?" He said, "I'm going to Rome tonight for 3 days of meetings. With whom should I not be photographed?" I said, "This is entrepreneurial Protestantism at its finest, or an exercise in the virtue of prudence." I gave him an extensive list. 30 years ago tonight, on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall was peacefully breached. And while there would be more drama to come during the remaining 2 months of what we now know as the Revolution of 1989, the symbolic apogee, the symbolic high point of that year of miracles was reached when, in the words of that old American spiritual, the wall came tumbling down. A few months after, the desiccated leader of the East German Communist Party, Erich Honecker, had bragged that, quote, "the wall will last for another 100 years." The wall, for those of you who did not have the opportunity to experience it in person, was a vulgar, obscene thing, something like a festering wound, a deep gash in the body politic of the West. It was actually, in its Berlin instantiation, it was actually 2 concrete walls over 96 miles long, separated by perhaps 30 or 40 yards of sand and barbed wire, with automatically firing machine gun nests, guard posts, and attack dogs keeping watch, lest anyone escape the people's paradise of the German Democratic Republic. The wall was begun in 1961 to stem the flow of émigrés, primarily young professionals, from the German Democratic Republic, men and women who, by voting with their feet, gave poignant personal expression to one of the great black humor jokes of that era. Question: what is the relationship of democracy to socialist democracy? Answer: the same as the relationship between a chair and the electric chair. The side of the wall facing into West Berlin was entirely covered with graffiti for that whole 96-mile stretch, making the sheer brutality of the thing even uglier. And that ugliness was not merely physical. It was also spiritual, for the wall marked a divide between a world from which the God of the Bible had been expelled in the name of an ersatz form of human liberation, and a world that, however confusedly, retained some grip on the fact that its civilizational patrimony drew from the wellsprings of biblical religion. Standing on the West Berlin side of the wall in the fall of 1987, near what is now Alexanderplatz, I could not help noticing a ramshackle souvenir stand, which to my amazement was selling Che Guevara t-shirts. Evidence, I suppose, that some people never, ever get it. But there are less vulgar forms of not getting it, and they too should be called out for what they are. For they are distortions of reality that make it impossible to achieve the noblest aspirations of the human spirit, the aspirations to believe truly and worship that which is worthy of worship. Thus, just a few days ago, the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, wrote a brief essay on the fall of the wall, for which happy event he credited just about everyone and everything except the pivotal figure in the Revolution of 1989 and the religious sources of the Revolution of Conscience that made the nonviolent overthrow of the greatest tyranny in human history possible, which is to say that he ignored Pope John Paul II and the religiously informed and religiously sustained movements that gave the Revolution of 1989 its unique texture. Some people do get it, however, and one of them is America's most distinguished historian of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis of Yale University. Professor Gaddis is not a Catholic, so he cannot be accused of sectarian bias when he writes in his most recent book, "When John Paul II kissed the ground at the Warsaw airport on June 2, 1979, he began the process by which communism in Poland and ultimately everywhere would come to an end." There was then a deep and decisive causal connection between the first of the 9 days of John Paul II in Poland in June 1979 and the stunning events of 30 years ago tonight in Berlin. And the bright thread within that connection was religious freedom, for which the people of Poland demonstrated in Warsaw on that June 2nd, 1979, when they chanted rhythmically prior to the papal mass in Victory Square that day, "We want God, we want God." European communism, I suspect, would have died at some point of its own implausibility and its economic incapacities. And that point was almost certainly going to come far sooner than Erich Honecker and the other neo-Stalinist dinosaurs of the Warsaw Pact leadership in the 1980s anticipated. But if you ask the question, why did 1989 happen when it did, 30 years ago rather than 20 years ago in 1999 or 10 years ago in 2009 or even this year? And if you ask the further question, why did European communism collapse how it did, without mass violence, which was the 20th century's typical method of effecting great social change, then, like Professor Gaddis and other historians, not blinkered by a myopic secularism, you must give full marks to the revolution of conscience ignited by John Paul II in Poland in June 1979. How did that ignition take place? Look through the dozens of texts, homilies, speeches, impromptu remarks to various groups. Look through the dozens of texts of John Paul's 9 days, and you won't find the Pope making a single reference to politics or economics. Nor will you find any reference to Poland's communist government, which John Paul thanked on his arrival, thanked again on his departure, and completely ignored in the 9 days in between. Rather, in a host of variations on one great theme, John Paul II said to his fellow Poles over those 9 days on which the history of the 20th century pivoted, "You are not who they say you are. Remember who you really are, a people formed by faith and steeped in Christian history. Remember that, and you will eventually find tools of resistance that communism cannot match." That message resonated across a Central European landscape on which men and women of goodwill, believers and religious skeptics alike, had already been exploring ways to make the defense of fundamental human rights into a resistance tool against communism. After those 9 days of John Paul II in June 1979, new human rights initiatives were launched and new alliances were forged. At the center of each of those was religious freedom. And after 10 hard years, a nonviolent revolutionary movement determined to live in the truth, as Václav Havel put it, sustained by a powerful combination of faith and courage, and supported by effective Western foreign and defense policy triumphs. The wall did come tumbling down, and Stalin's derisive question, "How many divisions has the Pope?" got its answer. More than you know, more than you could ever imagine. It's a sadness that 3 decades later, the foreign minister of a united Germany does not understand the crucial role the demand for religious freedom played in the revolution of 1989, from which we may infer that the foreign minister's grip on the importance of religious freedom for sustaining democracy is not a firm grip. But Mr. Moss is not alone. Earlier this week, on Monday to be precise, the former president of Ireland, Mary McAleese, gave a bizarre speech at Trinity College Dublin, of which she is now the chancellor, in which she suggested that the baptism of infants may involve violations of the UN's Covenant on the Rights of the Child. And because there are no Charles Chappuis among the Catholic bishops of Ireland, there has been no challenge from an authoritative church voice on the Emerald Isle to this blatantly discriminatory suggestion from a public figure who is giving new definition to the meaning of self-loathing Catholic. But lest we dismiss President McAleese's rant as so much Celtic craziness, sorry, Tim O'Donnell, let's not forget that the previous American administration threatened to shackle, perhaps even literally, the Little Sisters of the Poor if they failed to provide contraceptives to which they were morally opposed to their employees. Let's not forget that Protestant ministers in Canada have been fined for preaching biblical morality. Let's not forget that in any number of other venues throughout the West, someone's claim to human rights has been used to whittle away at religious freedom in full. And that, of course, is before we get to the threats to religious freedom posed by jihadist Islam and neo-Maoist China. 30 years ago, in a moment of euphoria, we may have thought that history had vindicated the cause of freedom, especially religious freedom. Today, we must recall daily the motto on the Korean War Veterans Memorial a mile or so from where we meet tonight. Freedom is never free. To which we might add, freedom is never secure. Freedom must be earned anew, in every generation if we are, as President Kennedy pledged at the inaugural on January 20th, 1961, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And that's why the Religious Freedom Institute, under whose auspices we gather tonight, is such an important and welcome initiative. Important because of the nature of the cause, which is the defense of the first freedom. Welcome because of the immense wealth of talent and experience that RFI brings to its work here and around the world in cooperation with so many others. And that is why a leader like Archbishop Chaput is so important, because in that ongoing struggle to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, some must lead. Some must take the heat. Some must endure the slings and arrows of the critics. Some must say, here is where we must go, and then take the point, summoning others to follow. There is much work to do. History is not over, and to repeat, freedom is never free. So as we gather strength tonight for the task ahead, let us also remember on this stirring anniversary that the good guys sometimes win. More urgently, let us remember that the Lord always wins, because whether we understand his ways or not, we may be reassured by the words of St. John Henry Newman, he knows what he is about. Thank you.